Picture this. You're 19 years old, huddled in a waterlogged trench in the Hurtgen forest. It's the winter of 1944. The cold isn't just weather. It's an enemy seeping into your bones. You haven't had a hot meal in weeks. Your socks are disintegrating. Your feet are numb. And you're living in a constant state of exhaustion and fear. Then, on a supply run back to the rear, you see it. A compound just off the road, guarded by your own Inside are dozens of German prisoners, the same men who might have been shooting at your unit yesterday. And they're laughing. They're smoking cigarettes. Their faces are full, and the smell coming from their field kitchen is unmistakable. It's fresh bread, not H-A-R-D. T-A-C-K. Not cold beans. Real bread. A wave of anger, confusion, and betrayal hits you so hard, it takes your breath away. Why do they look healthier than we do? Welcome to Clandestine Combat. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of World War II's most uncomfortable and deliberately buried truths. The moment America's own soldiers started to believe their captured enemies were being treated better than they were. This isn't a myth. It's a systemic reality born from a perfect storm of law, logistics, and a desperate moral calculus. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand the why, and it will challenge everything you thought you knew about the good war. If stories that reveal the gritty, unvarnished, and often shocking truths of history are your kind of thing, then you're home. Welcome to Clandestine Combat. Do us a favor right now. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It's the single best way to support our mission to bring these hidden stories to light, and it makes sure you don't miss our next deep dive, which could change your perspective on another piece of history. That like and subscribe means the world to us. Now, let's get into it. To grasp this bizarre reality, we have to leave the battlefield for a moment and step into the halls of international diplomacy. In 1929, long before the storm clouds of World War II gathered, the world's powers, including the United States and Germany, sat down in Switzerland and signed a revised Geneva Convention. This document specifically laid out, in precise legal detail, the treatment of prisoners of war. It wasn't just about kindness. It was about establishing a code of conduct to prevent the worst atrocities of World War I from happening again. The U.S. Senate ratified it. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt and the War Department were adamant the United States would follow the Geneva Convention to the absolute letter. But this commitment wasn't driven by sentiment alone. It was a cold, strategic move. America had a terrifying number of its sons flying over and fighting on German and Japanese territory. Tens of thousands would become POWs. The U.S. strategy was one of strict reciprocity. The idea was simple. If we set the gold standard for treating our prisoners, we create a powerful legal and moral lever. We can point to our own impeccable record and demand the same treatment for our boys in enemy hands. It was a high-stakes insurance policy, with the premiums paid not in money, but in the daily comfort and morale of the frontline American. So, the machinery was built. A massive, bureaucratic system under the Provost Marshal General was created to process, transport, house, and feed enemy posts. And the key phrase in the Geneva Convention was Article 10, which stated that the food ration for prisoners should be equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the depot troops of the captor's army. Now, read that carefully. Depot troops, base troops, garrison, soldiers, not the guys in the frontline foxholes. This single legal phrase created the foundational crack in the system. The standard of comparison wasn't the infantryman shivering in the Ardennes. It was the private living in a well-supplied barracks in Kansas. And America, the arsenal of democracy, was building those barracks. By 1945, over 400,000 Axis POWs, the vast majority German, were held in over 500 camps across the United States. They weren't thrown into dungeons. They were housed in facilities often built by the Army Corps of Engineers, featuring barracks with bunk beds, heating stoves, laundry facilities, and running water. They had designated areas for sports soccer fields, baseball diamonds. They had libraries with thousands of books, often in their own language. They formed orchestras, put on plays, and took college-level correspondence courses. They were paid for their work in canteen coupons, which they could spend on beer, cigarettes, chocolate, and other goods at the camp store, the post exchange, the PX. Now, let's teleport back to that Guy. In the Hurtgen forest, or the mud of Italy, or the hellscape of Okinawa, his world is defined by scarcity and improvisation. His bed is a hole in the ground. His heating is a tiny, fume-filled stove in a tent, if he's lucky. Hot chow is a rare miracle, often arriving cold and congealed after a perilous journey from the field kitchen. His rations are designed for survival, not satisfaction. Hardtack biscuits that could break teeth, canned meat that was a vague mystery, powdered eggs that reconstituted into a rubbery mess, fresh fruit, a fantasy. His uniform, meant for a temperate climate, was useless in a European winter until later improvised fixes. Medical care, while heroic, was a triage nightmare. Overworked doctors using dwindling supplies in tents pelted by rain or under threat of artillery, and the idea of paid leisure. His paycheck was mostly theoretical, with little to spend it on but maybe a gambling game with his buddies. The contrast between the two worlds wasn't just academic, it was visceral, observable, and reported. Soldiers on leave back in the States would sometimes see POW work details in their crisp, clean uniforms, looking well fed, and the bitterness would boil over. Letters home from disgruntled GIs began mentioning it. We're over here living like rats, and I hear the Nazis back home are living it up. The rumor mill in the army turned this into a potent source of resentment. But the story gets even more specific and more galling. Take the issue of food. The official U.S. Army ration for a POW in a stateside camp was around 4,000 calories per day. This was to sustain men doing manual labor. Meanwhile, the frontline soldiers' ration provided about 2,830 calories, and it was monotonous and the ration was slightly better, but heavy and boring. More importantly, the POW diet included fresh bread, meat, vegetables, and dairy items that were strictly rationed for American civilians. There are documented cases of communities near POW camps complaining that the prisoners were eating better than their own families. And then there were the Red Cross parcels. These international relief packages were a godsend for Allied posts in German camps. But the same system worked in reverse. The German Red Cross, via the Swiss, sent parcels to German posts in America. These parcels contained luxuries like real coffee, chocolate, sardines, and fine cigarettes. American guards, bound by the Geneva rules, had to distribute them. So, a German prisoner could be supplementing his already ample U.S. Army diet with gourmet European treats, while the American guard standing watch over him might be dreaming of a decent cup of coffee. The protection offered to these prisoners was another bitter pill for combat troops to swallow. The U.S. military police were under ironclad orders to protect posts from any harm, including harm from their own enraged comrades. There are numerous accounts from veterans of the Battle of the Bulge, where the fury towards the enemy was white, of American MPs physically stepping between vengeful GS and captured German soldiers, saying, "He's a prisoner now. Step back." Imagine that psychological whiplash. You've just seen your best friend killed by a German artillery shell. You helped capture the gun crew that fired it, and your own military police, your brothers in arms, are now defending those men from your justified rage. The MPs were doing their duty, enforcing the Geneva Convention to prevent war crimes and ensure reciprocity. But in that moment, to the frontline soldier, it felt like the system was siding with the enemy. So why didn't the High Command, seeing the collapsing morale, just divert some of those POW supplies to the front? The answer lies in the rigid, bureaucratic separation of systems. The supply chain for posts was a separate legal entity. The food, the blankets, the medical supplies for the camps were earmarked and accounted for under international law. To take a Red Cross parcel or a camp mattress and send it to the front would be an unambiguous violation of the Geneva Convention. The fear was immediate and severe reprisal. If the Germans got wind that the US was stealing from POW supplies, they would have a legitimate excuse to cut rations and medicine to the American posts in Stalag Luft camps. For General Eisenhower and the War Department, it was a brutal math problem. The immediate, tangible morale damage to a few million frontline soldiers had to be weighed against the potential life or death consequences for hundreds of thousands of American prisoners. They chose the latter. They saw the comfort of the enemy POW as the direct price for the survival of their own captured men. Beyond the legal reciprocity, there were other, more pragmatic forces at work. The posts in America weren't just mouths to feed. They were a massive, captive labor force. With American men overseas, the home front faced a critical labor shortage. German posts worked on farms, harvesting the wheat that fed the army and the Allies. They worked in timber mills, canneries, and factories. They did dangerous jobs like clearing brush and fighting forest fires. This labor was economically vital. A healthy, well-fed prisoner was a productive worker. A sick or starving one was not. So the good treatment had a direct economic return, fueling the very war machine that was fighting their comrades overseas. There was also a powerful, subtle form of psychological warfare at play. The good treatment was a living advertisement for American abundance and the futility of fighting it. German prisoners were allowed to write home, and their letters were full of astonished descriptions of the incredible wealth of America. The endless food, the modern facilities, the sheer size of everything. This directly contradicted Nazi propaganda, which painted America as a weak, decadent, and racially inferior society on the brink of collapse. These letters, circulating in Germany, became a potent tool for undermining the German war effort. They sowed doubt and defeatism. Why fight a country that has so much and treats its enemies so well? In a strange way, the full bellies of the posts were a weapon aimed at the heart of the Third Reich's morale. It is crucial to add nuance here. This better treatment was largely for posts held in the continental United States. The experience in forward area cage camps in Europe immediately after capture was often harsh, chaotic, and much more reflective of the war's brutality. Conditions there were Spartan and security was tight. The transit to the safety of the states was the dividing line. Furthermore, this policy did not apply equally to all Japanese POWs due to cultural differences. A different Japanese military code that viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace, and the sheer savagery of the Pacific War, often faced much harsher initial treatment and deep suspicion, though official U.S. policy still aimed for Geneva standards. And we cannot forget the secret side of the war, the interrogation centers like Fort Hunt, Virginia, where the gloves came off and psychological pressure was applied. Far from the view of the International Red Cross, the pristine POW camp system was the public face, the proof of American virtue, but it wasn't the whole story. The legacy of this policy is a complex knot of moral victory and human resentment. By most historical accounts, the reciprocal treatment strategy worked. American and British prisoners in German camps, especially the airmen in the Luftwaffe-run Stalag Luft camps, were treated better than Soviet or Polish prisoners who were often deliberately starved and murdered. The German High Command, however brutal, often felt compelled to maintain a basic standard for Western Allied posts, knowing their own men were being held to that standard in America. So, the cold calculus had a result. It saved American lives, but the cost was borne by the psyche of the frontline. He fought and often died, believing his country valued the rules of war and the well-being of its enemy prisoners over his own immediate comfort and sense of justice. It created a lasting sense of betrayal in many veterans, a feeling that only those who had been in the mud could truly understand. This is the uncomfortable heart of the story that clandestine combat exists to explore. War is never just good versus evil on a battlefield. It's a maze of impossible choices, bureaucratic decisions made thousands of miles away, and unintended consequences that ripple through history. The American soldier of World War II was told he was fighting for a world of law and order against tyranny. He just never imagined that on his hardest, coldest, hungriest days, the most visible symbol of that law and order would be the well-fed, sheltered enemy prisoner, protected by his own nation's promise. It's a paradox that doesn't diminish their sacrifice, but complicates our easy narratives, forcing us to confront the difficult prices paid for principle. But to truly feel the weight of this paradox, we have to move beyond the policy and into the personal. We have to listen to the voices of the men who lived this contradiction. Take the account of a young lieutenant from the 1st Infantry Division, who, after weeks of brutal combat in the Hurtgen, was tasked with escorting a group of newly captured Germans to the rear. He described them as sullen, expecting harsh treatment, but when they arrived at the transient camp, they were processed, given a hot meal from a proper kitchen truck, and issued clean blankets. He stood there, unshaven, his uniform stiff with mud and blood, watching these enemies receive care he hadn't known in a month. He wrote in his diary, "I felt a fool. A dirty, exhausted fool. We were winning the war, but they were winning the peace of a full stomach and a dry bed. The justice of it tasted like ash." Or consider the perspective from the other side. German posts, especially those brought to America, often experienced a kind of bewildered shock. Many expected retaliation, brutality, or, at best, sparse rations. Instead, they found order, abundance, and a surprising degree of freedom within the wire. One prisoner, a former Africa Corps soldier held in a camp in Texas, later recalled, "We could not understand it. Your farmers would hire us to pick cotton, and the farmer's wife would bring us a lunch of roast beef sandwiches, pie, and cold milk. We thought it was a trick at first. We were enemies. But it was not a trick. It was simply America." These stories filtered back to the front through letters and rumors, deepening the GI's sense of alienation. It wasn't just that the enemy was being treated well, it was that the enemy was being treated with a kindness and normalcy that felt utterly disconnected from the savage reality of the war they were still fighting. This disconnect fueled incidents that strained military discipline. There are reports of fights breaking out in rear areas when G's on leave encountered POW work, details being served lunch in public. There was the infamous case at a camp in Concordia, Kansas, where American soldiers training nearby broke into the POW canteen one night, stealing cigarettes and candy. Not out of need, but out of sheer spite. The official reprimand called it destruction of property, but everyone knew it was an act of protest. The War Department, acutely aware of this bubbling resentment, actually launched a propaganda campaign aimed at soldiers in the home front. Short films and articles were produced explaining the Geneva Convention and the principle of reciprocity. They urged troops to understand that treating prisoners well was the best guarantee for the safety of their own captured buddies. But for a man whose best friend had just been killed by a sniper, that abstract principle was a cold comfort compared to the immediate, visceral injustice of a prisoner enjoying a luxury he was denied. The labor program itself became a double-edged sword. While it helped the American economy, it created surreal and galling situations. In the Pacific Northwest, German posts were used as lumberjacks. They lived in work camps, were paid fair wages for their labor in camp scrip, and were often on excellent terms with the American civilian contractors, who valued their skills and strong work ethic. Meanwhile, in the bloody island-hopping campaign, Marines were suffering unimaginable horrors for yards of ground. The newsreels back home sometimes showed these POW work details looking robust and busy, which played very poorly with families who had sons in the Pacific. The phrase white glove treatment started appearing in newspaper editorials, questioning the policy. The War Department found itself walking a tightrope, justifying its humane treatment while trying to assure a war-weary public and a frustrated army that this was all part of a larger, smarter strategy. And what of the Japanese POWs? Their story highlights the limits and the hypocrisy within the system. As mentioned, the treatment was often harsher. Cultural contempt, The memory of Baton and the Japanese soldiers' reluctance to surrender meant that those who were captured were often viewed as uniquely treacherous or while the same Geneva rules technically applied, the application was frequently stricter, with more confinement and less fraternization. Yet, even here, the system could produce its own bizarre contrasts. Some Japanese posts held in camps in the American interior, once they were fully processed and the war fervor dimmed, also experienced decent treatment, medical care, adequate food, shelter. For a U.S. Marine fighting on Iwo Jima, taking a hill against suicidal resistance, the very idea that any Japanese soldier anywhere was receiving medical attention would have seemed a profound betrayal. This racial dimension added another layer of bitterness to the overall feeling of inequity. As the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the paradox didn't disappear. It evolved. Now, the German posts became disarmed enemy forces for a time, but their comfortable captivity continued. Meanwhile, the American soldier, the victor, often found himself stuck in a muddy occupation zone in Germany, living in bombed-out buildings, still dealing with supply shortages, and now tasked with the immense burden of rebuilding a continent and managing displaced persons. The good life of the POW in Kansas seemed to stretch on indefinitely, while the victor's life remained austere and difficult. For many GIs, the final insult was the pace of repatriation. American prisoners in German camps were flown home quickly, as heroes as they should have been. But the process of sending hundreds of thousands of German posts home from the US was slow, deliberate, and stretched into 1946 and even 1947. They were still there, still being fed and housed by the US government, while American families were struggling with the peacetime transition and shortages. The long-term impact of this policy on the veterans was profound but rarely spoken of in the grand narratives of the greatest generation. It seeded a deep, quiet cynicism about the military bureaucracy and government promises. It reinforced the old soldiers' belief that the rear echelon and the folks back home would never understand the sacrifices of the front line. This feeling that the system could be fair in theory but brutally unfair in practice shaped many veterans' views of authority for the rest of their lives. They had won the war, but they carried home a lesson in the complexities of justice that no parade could erase. So, was the policy a success? From the strategic high-altitude view of history, the answer is likely yes. It probably saved thousands of American and British posts from a fate far worse. It bolstered America's moral standing in the post-war world, a currency that was vital in the emerging Cold War. It even contributed, in a small way, to the rehabilitation of West Germany as an ally. But from the WWII view of the man in the foxhole, the answer is far more. It felt like a betrayal. It felt like his suffering was being used as a bargaining chip, and his enemy was the beneficiary. This is the essential tension clandestine combat seeks to expose. The gap between the clean lines of history written in textbooks and the messy, emotionally charged reality lived by those who were there. The story of the well-treated POW is not a footnote. It is a central chapter in understanding the American experience in World War II. It forces us to ask hard questions. Can a principle be so important that upholding it, even when it hurts your own, is the right thing to do? Does the end saving more lives, winning the peace, justify the means of demoralizing the very men tasked with winning the war? There is no easy answer. There is only the uncomfortable truth that in the pursuit of a more humane world, the US made a conscious choice to extend that humanity first to its captured enemies, trusting that the benefits would eventually circle back to its own sons. The G is in the field, paid the upfront cost in morale and bitterness. They are the ones who smelled that fresh bread baking for the enemy and had to turn back to their foxhole, to their cold beans, and to the relentless, bloody task of winning. Their sacrifice was not just in blood, but in bearing the weight of that difficult, calculated, and profoundly lonely choice. If this journey into the heart of one of war's greatest ironies has held your attention, if it made you pause and think, then we've accomplished something here at Clandestine Combat. But the conversation shouldn't end with this video. History is a dialogue. I want to hear from you in the comments. Put yourself in those muddy boots. Knowing what you know now, could you have accepted the reasoning? Could you have looked at that well-fed prisoner and understood the greater game? Or would the anger have been too much? Share your thoughts, your family stories, your perspectives, and then share this video. Share it because stories this nuanced, this challenging, deserve to be part of our collective memory. They prevent us from simplifying the past into fairy tales. They honor the complexity of the sacrifices made. For more deep dives that challenge the standard narrative, make sure you're subscribed. We're just getting started. Until next time,